Kristin Bliksrud og Aavitsland, som professor i kunsthistorie og middelalderhistorie og en del andre ting, skal fortelle om, som dere ser, fader Couturier, Alain Couturier, en dominikaner, som godt representert her, fordi det han som har malt alle freskene, og også han som har laget glassmaleriene. Så vi gleder oss veldig. Vær så god, Kristin.
Thank you. I hope you hear me. Dear Dominicans, dear friends, thank you for attending this talk, which I give in English for the benefit of the brothers' foreign guests. It is a great honor to speak at this occasion, and not least in this room, where I have attended Mass since I was a child. And I have, however, never earlier had the opportunity to take the word myself here. And I do that now in the capacity of a friend of the Oslo Dominicans, but also, as Father Jonatle mentioned, as an art historian. Given my academic discipline, what I could offer as a contribution to the brothers' centennial was a study of the artistic decoration in this church, which is so dear to me and my family and to numerous Catholics in Oslo and Norway. So I have thus contributed with such a study to the Jubilee book published a few months ago, and today I will present some of the insights gained from that study. And for those of you who have already read that, I apologize for repeating myself a bit. The frescoes and the stained glass windows in this room are the work of one man, Father Alain Couturier. And they have become perhaps so familiar to those of us who frequent this church that perhaps we don't really see them anymore. So this talk is an attempt to make us see them with new eyes, so to speak, and we are in the privileged position to have the art before our eyes as I talk, and I will naturally focus on the works we see here and not so much, or leave out the other frescoes in the church narthex outside, with those you can read about in my article. And then I will, so you'll have to turn and look at the frescoes as I talk, and I will show you some additional images also projected here on the wall, and I hope that, it's not too much sunshine outside, so it's possible to see them. Okay. The Dominicans arrived here in Oslo from France a century ago, and they had their church erected a few years after their arrival, and to do so, they engaged a well-established Norwegian architect, Harald Sund, whose picture you barely can see on the wall now. And what they got from him was this sober and delicate building, hinting discreetly at the Romanesque style with its round arches. And as such, the Dominicans' new church was representative of church architecture in Lutheran Norway at the time. The nearby Majorstuen church, in an old photograph that before its large tower was erected, as you see here, drawn by the same architect and inaugurated at the same year as construction work began here, is a case in point. So this similarity to contemporary Lutheran church architecture is characteristic of most Catholic churches in Norway from the late 19th century and early 20th. They were usually drawn by Norwegian non-Catholic architects and they adhere to the taste and architectural habits of the period and do not stand out from the more numerous Lutheran churches in this country, except, of course, for certain liturgical adaptations in the interior. Regarding the artwork in Norwegian Catholic churches, it is extremely rare that the embellishment is planned as a kind of comprehensive visual program undertaken by one single artist, or undertaken by any real artist at all, I have to say. This is the case here in St. Dominic, and that makes this church something of an exception in a Norwegian context. And as I said, the artwork here is due to one man only. Both the frescoes and the stained glass windows are made by the French Dominican Alain Couturier. Here's an image of him taken in the narthex of this church. He stands, as you may see, perhaps in front of the fresco that he made there. Father Couturier is a highly interesting figure in the art history as well as in the church history of the 20th century. Not perhaps so much because of his art, but because of his thinking about the relationship between religion and visual art. He seems to have pondered over this relationship for a lifetime, and this pondering eventually brought him far away from what we see before our eyes here today in this church. And I'll tell you where his journey ended in a while, but first we need to know a little more about him and then have a closer look at the works he made to embellish this sacred room. Marie-Hélène Couturier arrived here in Oslo 17th of July 1928 as a young friar who had just recently entered the Dominican order. He had just turned 30, and he had a background from art studies in Paris, the metropolis of modern art. When entering religious life, Couturier had been willing to give up his career as an artist. His superiors, however, encouraged him to continue to paint and assigned him with several decoration tasks for Dominican churches, chapels, and convents in France, in Rome, and here. As painter and friar, Couturier came to identify with Fra Angelico, his fellow Italian 15th century Dominican, one of his paintings you can see on the wall now. And just like Fra Angelico, Couturier regarded eventually creative artistic work as part of his apostolate. And his assignment in Oslo was his first larger commission, and he came here to paint frescoes during the summer months of 1928 and 29. And later in the 1930s, he also came to Oslo to decorate the chapel at the Katarinahjemmet, the Dominican Sisters chapel, but that is another story. And Couturier was very well equipped for this task. During his art studies in Paris, his mentors had been Catholic expressionists like Maurice Denis and Georges Destroyer. And these painters had founded the Atelier des Arts Sacrés, an artistic movement whose aim was to reform and renew ecclesiastical art in the Catholic world. Church art in Catholic Europe at the time was very often mass-produced, and it was dominated by a saccharine sentimentalism, which lacked both artistic integrity and religious depth, according to Denis and Destroyer. This is just, it's artworks like this that they opposed to. That was sentimental and shallow, according to their view. So what I wished was to update sacred art to the language of modernism, and at the same time revive the great pre-modern tradition of church decoration. So the ambition was to create sacred art that was beautiful, meaningful, and truly of its own time. So this was the ideology, so to speak, that young Couturier had, in which he had his artistic education. And he came to specialize in stained glass painting and fresco painting, which are, of course, the two canonical genres of historical ecclesiastical art. So let's now see how he put these ideals into practice here in this church. He started out with the niches about each of the church side altars, which probably were designed to be frescoed from the very beginning. And I just have to remind you that originally these two niches that you see on both sides of the chancel, they were originally they had proper altar tables in front of them. So they were not only niches like they are now, but they had, they were altars in a more explicit way than they probably, I suppose that this alteration came after the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. So both these niches depict, as you see, a group of standing saints, and hence they clearly correspond to each other visually as well as thematically. And I hope that you all see both, both the frescoes from where you sit, because I will not project them on the wall. It seems strange to do so when you have the real thing here in front of you. So according to the convent's chronicle, the one that Couturier did first of these two was this fresco above the altar dedicated to Our Lady. And here we see that, not surprisingly at all, the Virgin Mary is given the pride of place in the composition. And what you see here is a young, lean and tall, beautiful Virgin Mary dressed in a simple red garment, presenting the Christ child to the viewer, so to speak. And his outstretched arms make, as you see, his tiny body form the figure of a cross as a kind of omen, hinting at his death at Golgotha, of course. And I don't know if you immediately identify the saints surrounding the Virgin. You may guess or see at once that to the left St. Peter stands because of his compulsory attribute, the keys, and he is accompanied by St. Paul, who stands behind him, that we barely see. The physiognomies of these two princes of the apostles, the way they look, conform to the continuous iconographical convention dating back to the early church, in fact. St. Peter with grey curly hair and beard, and St. Paul with a dark beard and a narrow face and a very receding hairline. That is how they have looked since the 4th century. So they are easily recognizable. To the right, the two additional male saints here are harder to identify by means of their appearance. The young beardless man next to the Virgin, he gives us, his attire gives us a clue because he's dressed as a deacon, and that corresponds to the identity he's given in the convent's chronicle. He is the proto-martyr Saint Stephen, and the bearded man next to him, depicted in profile and with folded hands, is Saint Joseph, the husband of the Virgin. So behind this group of, so all these saints are of course there from the New Testament, central figures, and no one of them are very surprising to find here. Behind them, you see that there is a very familiar piece of architecture. It is the church of it's the church of Saint Dominic in Oslo. The tower rises in the background to the right, and below the fresco there is an inscription quoting the first line of Hail Mary in Norwegian: Hill deg Maria, full av nåde, Herren med deg. You see also that the saint stands on a tiled floor. I have been given access to a watercolor study for this fresco in private ownership. You may see it here. I'm very grateful for being able to show it. And here you can see that Couturier introduced a kind of balustrade in front of Peter and Paul to the left, probably to balance the composition by introducing yet another architectural element to balance with the church in the background. And looking carefully on the fresco, you can see that this was how it looked from the beginning, but that Couturier obviously changed his mind when he worked with this fresco. And I think we all can agree that that was a fortunate decision, I have to say. I think it looks better, very, very much better without the balustrade. I will just also say one word about the genre of this fresco. The Virgin and Child flanked by standing saints is an iconographical convention from the early Italian Renaissance called a sacra conversazione, a sacred conversation. And supposedly, the first known painting composed on this scheme is the altarpiece that Fra Angelico made around 1450 for his convent San Marco in Florence, and which you see here. You can even see Saint Dominic on the left. So we may, of course, speculate that Couturier's outspoken affection for his 5th century Dominican colleague influenced the way he composed his Marian fresco in Oslo. But this remains, of course, a conjecture, because we don't have any sources telling us about that. In any case, the choice of iconography here, probably taken in agreement with Father Béchot, the prior of the convent at the time, is not at all surprising for a Marian altar. If we turn to the side altar at the other side of the chancel arch, we immediately see that Couturier has left the idea of placing his figures in a defined pictorial space with recognizable architectural props, as he did here. This fresco is composed on the flat, with the figures standing in an abstract, non-specific landscape in what we could call a modernist manner. And we need to, it's important that we imagine the tabernacle removed here, because, so that as it is now, we don't see the lower part of the fresco. The tabernacle originally stood here in the chancel, on the main altar against the wall. And it was moved to this place in the wake of Vatican II. But even this is a clearly more sort of modernist composition than the other fresco. Even here we find very clear references to iconographical conventions established by the tradition of pre- and early modern church art. This northern altar is dedicated to Saint Dominic and the saints of the Dominican order. And Couturier has chosen to depict a group of 6 Dominican saints whose black and white habits effectively contrast with the red ground and the dramatic blue sky behind them. The 6 saints are identified by inscriptions below the fresco, many of which we don't see now because of the tabernacle. But in the middle, we see Saint Dominic himself, and his black coat, over his white habit reflects this design of the order's emblem. Perhaps you, I'll try to visualize this on the slide. And I think this is a very conscious choice of Couturier to visualize or to give Saint Dominic the arms of the order, sort of to bear it at his breast, so to speak. And the child saint, Imelda Labertini, stands in front of the group, whereas Saint Catherine of Siena and Saint Louis Bertrand flank Saint Dominic to the left. And to the right, there are Saint Peter Martyr and Saint Thomas Aquinas. Saint Thomas presents his vast theological scholarship to us in the form of an open codex. There is an interesting detail that usually escapes the beholder, and it was not at all exposed to me before I had a professional photographer making a shot of this fresco. St. Thomas with his codex here, you can't see, I'm sorry that you can't see it, it's too light in this room, but there is an image of this in the Jubilee book, because St. Thomas Codex actually has both text and images in it, and it's very hard to see that just looking at the fresco. The right page of his book exhibits the heading Soli Deo, to God alone, whereas the opposite page carries a depiction of Christ in glory. I'm very sorry that this was not visible on this projection. But that is also interesting, of course. In the Dominican fresco, Couturier moves more clearly, and than in the Marian fresco, applies a formal language derived from early modernism. The figures, modeled on cone-shaped volumes, create a decorative composition in which their black and white vestments shape a uniform yet dynamic and contrasting coloristic scheme. The modernist idiom also implies a movement towards abstraction and idealization, for instance with regard to representations of violence, bodily wounds, and strong emotions. Whereas artists in earlier centuries would loudly have communicated the terrors of St. Peter's martyrdom and the ecstasy of St. Catherine's mystical experience, Couturier prefers to imply these things very discreetly. The wound in the skull that killed St. Peter of Verona is just hinted at. I don't think my slides here has any value at all, but you can clearly see in the fresco itself. He just has a tiny scar on his skull, and Saint Catherine's stigmata is very cautionally represented as a small scar on her hand. Nevertheless, there are clear references also to the art historical tradition in Couturier's Dominican fresco. The depiction of Saint Catherine quotes one of the most famous representations of these Sienese saints, a panel painting from the late 14th century in the Dominicans' church in Siena, which I suppose it's very famous and probably familiar to many of you, as you see here. And the 16th century missionary Saint Louis Bertrand, posing next to Saint Catherine with a hood over his head, also seemed to be a reference to older art. Here, Couturier probably refers to the most renowned portrait of this Spanish Dominican saint, painted by Francisco de Zurbarán in 1636. Why were exactly these 6 saints chosen for this altar fresco? Again, the selection of saints must have been an agreement between Couturier and the small community in Oslo. Saint Dominic, founder of the order and the saint to whom the church was dedicated, is of course an obvious choice, as are the 2 prominent Dominican saints, Catherine and Thomas Aquinas. But what about the 3 others, Saint Peter of Verona, Saint Louis Bertrand, and Saint Imelda Lambertini? We should remember that the vocation of the French Dominicans, established here in a Lutheran and increasingly secularized country, was that of Dominicans in all times. It was mission and evangelization by appeal to reason, compassion, and charity. Hence, it was highly appropriate to include 2 Dominican missionary saints in the fresco. Saint Peter of Verona, who in the 14th century fought the Cathar heresy in southern France by preaching the gospel, and Saint Louis Bertrand, who in the 16th century evangelized Native Americans in today's Colombia and defended their rights against the suppression of the Spanish colonizers. The role of little Imelda Lambertini from Bologna in the fresco is less obvious, perhaps, except for her being a Dominican, despite of her very young age. According to her own wish, Imelda became a Dominican novice at the age of 9 and showed a particularly strong devotion to the Blessed Sacrament. At 11, she died in a kind of ecstasy, receiving her first Holy Communion. A possible explanation of her presence in Couturier's frescoes could be the increased popularity in connection with Pope Pius X's reintroduction of First Communion for children in 1909. Here's an image of the Pope Pius X distributing the Holy Communion to children, and that image actually it's a framed photograph that actually is hanging in the home of Sigrid Undset at Lillehammer. So she, as you know, was also a friend of this house and an important sponsor of the church here. So this attention towards children's religious upbringing was prominent in the church in the beginning of the 20th century, and in general, but especially within the Dominican order, it seems. And the first generation Oslo Dominicans seem to have taken this very seriously. They arranged catechesis for Catholic children and conferred to them their first communion in this church. And here's a photograph of a small first communicant. She is standing in the old convent here, and if the light had been more appropriate, you would also have seen that there is actually one of the sketches by Couturier is sitting on the bookshelf beside her. Anyway, this was something that the first generation Dominicans took very seriously here in Oslo at the time, and that may explain Santa Imelda's presence in the fresco. The Oslo Dominicans' calling for childcare did not last very long, it seems, however. Having frequented this church as a child myself, I cannot say that any measures at all were taken to accommodate for children in the 1970s and the 1980s. Rather the contrary, perhaps. In any event, the group of Dominican saints in Couturier's fresco represent the broad mission of the order's small Oslo community: teaching and theological studies, evangelization, and administration of the sacraments. These two altar niches were frescoed in the summer of 1928, as I said, and they were consecrated during Sunday Mass, 2nd September that year. And next summer, Couturier came back to adorn the church with more frescoes, first and foremost the most ambitious one, the large frescoes here at the northern wall that I recommend you to turn to look at that. Now, this large fresco indeed dominates the church interior because of its size, of course. Still, we often tend to forget a little about it because during liturgy, our attention is directed towards the chancel. But let's have a look at it now. It is, as you see, painted on a huge field, protruding a few centimeters from the wall, and it has a two-piece composition, one could say. In the upper part, risen Christ appears in mid-air, with beams of gleaming light radiating from his body, and he looks downwards to his mother, who is seated directly below him in the lower part of the fresco. The two actually exchange glances, it seems. And around the seated Virgin are the 12 apostles, 6 on each side, all gazing upwards to Christ, gesturing in ways that express devotion, surprise, prayer, and strong emotions. The gray-haired man to the right of the Virgin is recognizable as Saint Peter, with his gray hair, and all of the rest of the apostles are sort of generically depicted as young and beardless. This scene takes place against a reddish background with a very, very abstracted architecture hinted at the sides. The style of this fresco, as well as certain specific features of it, strongly recalls El Greco's painting Pentecost from around 1600. The figure, which you see here, the figure of the Virgin seems to be borrowed from El Greco, but also the postures and facial features of some of the apostles are very similar. Couturier's fresco differs, however, from El Greco's panel in the coloristic scheme, and also in regard to the subject matter. Just on a general note, it's interesting to see how Couturier relates to El Greco, which was a very common thing to do for modernist painters in this period. El Greco being a very particular Baroque painter with a sort of expressionist style that differs largely from other Baroque painting. He became extremely influential as a kind of inspiration for early modernist painters. So in that, Couturier is very, very typical of his time. El Greco's painting is a representation of Pentecost. Couturier proves to be iconographical innovative in this fresco because he combines two events from the Gospel, Pentecost, but also the foregoing Ascension. And this merging of the two events is very unusual in the history of Christian iconography. In fact, I cannot think of one single other example of this merging. But the combination is theologically sound, as Pentecost is the direct consequence of the Ascension. When the Virgin and the Apostles receive the Holy Ghost at Pentecost, what happens is that they gain insight about the truth of the risen and ascended Christ. And this seems to be the message of this fresco. Father Jon Atle has preached very prudently about this in a sermon from 2019, which still is available online. and recommended hereby. In addition to these three works that we see in the church, and I have spoken a little about now, Couturier also frescoed the narthex. And the frescoes there, the two frescoes there, are also interesting, and I recommend that you have a closer look at them when leaving today. I will, at this point, not say anything about them, however, since we can't see them. So in the last part of this talk, I would like to say a few words about the three windows in the chancel that Couturier designed in the 1930s. The high, narrow windows invite representation of tall, lean figures, and Couturier chose to represent Christ in glory in the middle window, and an upright and honorable angel in each of the flanking windows. For your benefit, I've put a close-up on the wall, maybe more easy to see details of the iconography there, perhaps. The three figures are framed in the same manner and with the same colors, and hence it creates a kind of unity between the three separate windows. Christ carries a large book and raises his right hand in a gesture of blessing, and tongues of fire emerge above his head. And the two angels are similar, very similar in stature and appearance, but the sparkling colors of their vestments differ. If you look closely, you may see that they carry objects from Christ's passion. The angel to the left holds the crown of thorns on veiled hands, whereas the angel to the right carries the nails from the cross. It's not very easy to see, but if you look really close, really carefully, you may see that they actually carry these objects. And the inclusion of nails and crown of thorns reflect, of course, the ritual repetition of Christ's sacrificial death during the liturgy of the Eucharist, taking place below the windows. And I think that the connection between the windows and the liturgy was even tighter before Vatican II, when the sacramental altar stood against the wall directly below the windows. Father Couturier designed these windows around 1935 in Paris, where he had them made in the workshop of his friend and colleague Marguerite Uré. Here she is. I will not say a lot about her, but she deserves to be mentioned because she was actually the one who fabricated these windows, and she should not be forgotten. But she was another artist connected to Atelier de Art Sacré. And the windows were finished in 1938, but it took some time. In fact, it took 14 years before they were installed here at their destination in Oslo. One reason for this was, of course, the World War, which was a serious obstacle to transport of glass art from Paris to Oslo, and I think everyone had other things to think about during those years than stained glass paintings. But another, less prosaic reason for this long, because it took such a long time before the windows arrived here, was probably Father Couturier's own development during these years. In the late 1930s, he became editor of a journal with the same aim as Maurice Denis and Georges Desvoyers had with the Atelier de Art Sacré, to renew and raise the quality of Catholic art and church decoration. And this journal, simply called L'Art Sacré, brought essays concerning the theological and philosophical foundation for church art. How were contemporary artists to visualize the sacred? Which style reflects the truth? Couturier asked in one of his articles. An important question for the journal was the relation between tradition and modernism, or widening the perspective beyond the field of art between the tradition of the church and modernity. And this was, as we all know, what the church fought to come to terms with at the Second Vatican Council some decades later. And as we also all know, there were no simple answers to that question. Aiming for a true renewal of church art, Father Couturier claimed that the church needed to regain its role as a patron for great artists, as it had in pre-modern and early modern times. Following up this ambition after the war, he got involved in a number of large-scale projects, not as an artist, but as a patron. He engaged the greatest artists of the 20th century to embellish churches and chapels. He worked with Marc Chagall and Pablo Picasso, and he had Fernand Léger making art for Sacré-Cœur d'Agincourt, which I here show you the baptistry of that church with Léger's stained glass, and Henri Matisse decorating the Dominican Chapelle du Rosaire, to mention a few examples. Not least did Couturier engage the most radical modernist of all, the Swiss architect Le Corbusier, to design the Dominicans' convent La Tourette outside Lyon, which is very familiar, I suppose, to the Dominicans present here. And collaborating with these modern masters, of which few had any faith in Christianity, Couturier was convinced that true artistic excellence was more important than piety and faith for the creation of sacred art. Accordingly, he also came to doubt very much his own ability to create true art, and he questioned the value of his former artwork. Eventually, he ceased to paint and design at all. His fellow Dominican, Father Patford, who stayed here for many years, he reports that when Couturier finally came to Oslo in 1952 to install the windows he designed before the war, he was strongly dissatisfied with his large Ascension Pentecost fresco. Indeed, he wanted to have it removed. And that was a wish that fortunately was rejected by the brothers here, fortunately. At this point, his last visit to Oslo, a few months before he died, Couturier had traveled a very long way since he came to this house for the first time to paint frescoes. Because the great artists of the 20th century tended to leave figuration for abstraction, Couturier struggled very hard with the question of how the church was to relate to the non-figurative. And this was, and is, still a very tricky question indeed. For can a religion that has at its center the human figure of Christ, God incarnate, ever allow itself to escape figurative art? In his fight for sacred art, Couturier sought to renew it through the utilization of powerful contemporary forms and materials. And as a remedy, he eventually placed his trust in artists, believing that all true art revealed something of the sacred. And since true art could only be revealed by true artists, he therefore sought the services of the masters of his time, regardless of their religious beliefs or lack of such, to reach the sacred through the production of a supposedly true art. This strategy was met with criticism, and it still is. Dennis McNamara, an American art historian occupied with liturgical art, he had harshly criticized Couturier's post-war project, engaging artists who neither had an affinity nor any obligations towards the Church and the Catholic faith. And his strong accusation is that Couturier mistook the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, for the Holy Spirit. And that is a harsh accusation, I have to say. At this occasion, I will not take any stance towards that charge. Instead, I would like to emphasize Couturier's own artistic work and saying that if the aim of sacred art is to illustrate and illuminate the Catholic faith by means of rhetoric and to unfold the goodness, truth, and beauty of God, I think young Couturier did rather well here in the Dominican Church in Oslo. Thank you for your attention.
Det vanskelig å finne ord etter alt dette her. Vi veldig takknemlige, og det gir kanskje enda en ny mening å komme i kirken for alle oss, nå når vi kan, i tillegg til å komme for Guds ord, så kan vi også se det mer uttrykt gjennom vår broder, Alain Couturier. Så hjertelig takk. Det var helt fantastisk, og jeg håper kanskje du fortsetter å finne ut ting om han, som vi kan få høre om videre en annen gang. Kristin direktør nå for det norske instituttet i Roma, og det kan vel hende det ting i Roma som har connections.
Jeg har en plan om det.
Ja, så det gleder vi oss til, men foreløpig hjertelig tusen takk skal du ha. Da kan vi fordøye videre det vi har hørt nå. Og i ettermiddag så alle hjertelig velkommen til klosterruinene i gamle Oslo, hvor dominikanerne slo seg ned for en del år siden. Det står, det var i 1221. Og der skal vi synge et vesper. Vi skal synge første vesper til festen i morgen. Det Sankt Dominikus fest. Så klokken 5 det programmert. Alle hjertelig velkommen dit. Og i kveld så også alle hjertelig velkommen til en fest her i haven etterpå. Den starter sånn omtrent når vi kommer tilbake fra gamlebyen. Så da håper jeg at dere kommer alle sammen, enten det oppholdsvær eller ikke, for fest skal det bli uansett. Velkommen.